Welcome, everyone.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. And we're very fortunate that we have a moderator today from Higher Immigrants Ottawa. So Kelly, I'm going to hand this over to you to welcome everyone and begin the webinar.
Thank you, Valerie. Thank you so much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here with all of you today. Just a few notes before we start. One is that as we go through the presentations, if you've got questions, and we hope you have questions, please feel free to pop those into the chat. We will address all of the questions after the three presenters have presented, and look forward to some conversation and dialogue with you after those presentations. As per usual, we ask you to mute your microphone, turn off your phones for the presentation today. A couple of things that I wanted to touch on before we launch into our first presenter. One is that I wanted to acknowledge that the news in recent days, of course, from British Columbia, from London, Ontario, from other areas has been devastating. And just that this is a reminder that the work of both reconciliation and inclusion and equity are vital to our communities now and for our future. And leading from that, I want to acknowledge before we go into our event that the land from where I am presenting to you right now is the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. And I invite you to take the time to understand the history of the land wherever you live, wherever you conduct your work and your business. For those of us who emigrated to this land by choice, by force, by displacement, or were born here in subsequent generations, we recognize that as settlers and as immigrants, we are bound to the treaties of this land. And so that takes me now to our first presenter. And our first presenter today is Professor Francine Schlosser, here from the University of Windsor, where currently she holds the Odette Professorship in Entrepreneurship and Innovation. And Francine will present Resilience, Twice Made and Once Tested, Immigrant Entrepreneurs' Adaptation to the COVID-19 Pandemic. And Francine.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Kelly. So today I'm going to be presenting on, I'm just going to move this a little bit. Okay, I'm going to actually be presenting something a little bit different than what I had planned to present. And for researchers out there, I'm sure you know how difficult it is to collect data sometimes. And during the pandemic, it was even more difficult. So what's actually happened is I don't have much of a comparison here, but I am focusing quite a lot on immigrants. I've combined a couple of data sets that we were fortunate enough to collect over time, and I'm giving you what I can on this topic. Let's put it that way. It's not what I wanted to give you, but I'm giving you what I can. So I've been very fortunate to partner with Kyle Brickman, who's also on this call, and Jerry Kerr, who are both professors at the University of Windsor. And Kyle's study, it was a quantitative study, which I'll be talking about as study one, was funded by WeSpark, which is an initiative to fund COVID-19 related research. And Jerry Kerr, he has been funded through the BMRC for a paper, well, for a research on older immigrants. And so I'll also be talking about that one as well. And I partnered with both of them on both of those projects. Okay, there it is. Okay, so our research questions when we started out our different projects were basically how do immigrant SME, small, medium, and small and medium-sized enterprises, how do the owners of these small businesses build resilience necessary for survival under extreme pressure, especially during a COVID-19 pandemic? How do immigrant SME owners compare to native-born SME owners? And how does the mixed embeddedness concept explain the development of multiple levels of resilience in immigrant SME owners? So immigrants are extremely important in the world of business. So even just regular small and medium-sized enterprises make up 98% of the businesses in Canada. And they employ 2/3 of, they're actually responsible for 2/3 of the employment growth in Canada as well. So they're extremely important. And within SMEs, when we start looking at immigrant-owned SMEs, they actually are extremely entrepreneurial. So immigrants initiate more than 25% of US companies. I'm giving you US and Canadian data here. They're twice as likely to become entrepreneurs as native-born citizens. They're 1.3 times more likely to launch high-growth firms, providing most employment expansion in developed economies. They have higher survival rates, and they're very important trade intermediaries and with many transnational connections. So they often start businesses in 2 countries simultaneously, which also helps them grow. They are more likely to implement product, process, and marketing innovations. So very, very important in business. And many of them even come here and they're not under the category of business people. They come here because they're family, they're refugees, they might even be knowledge workers, and they still show entrepreneurial tendencies. And you'll see that in our study too. So the impact of COVID-19 has been pretty drastic on immigrant-owned SMEs. It's generally worldwide has had a more severe economic impact on immigrant business owners than on native business owners. Almost twice the rate of drop in US business ownership in the first 2 months of the pandemic. And the majority of the businesses in higher risk industries are owned by immigrants. So, I shouldn't say the majority, but a very significant, healthy amount. Immigrants own 33% of businesses in the accommodation and food services. And we know what's happened to tourism, hotels, restaurants during this COVID pandemic. It's been very difficult for them. However, they also own a respectable share of essential businesses, your corner stores and your grocery stores and that type of thing. And as the epidemic wore on, they were actually able to recover in some ways due to their presence in these essential businesses. So mixed embeddedness is a concept that's, I think it's spread through sociology as well as, the political area and now into entrepreneurship and business. And Kloosterman noted that it's really the interaction of social relations, economic transactions, and the surrounding political economic structures. So how embedded you are in that can affect certainly your resilience. So looking at it through these multiple levels will help us to better understand resilience. So we look at the macro level, which looks at the phenomena and the institutions, the meso level, which looks at more of the local opportunity, the business opportunity, and the micro level, which is at that level of the individual entrepreneur. So macro level embeddedness really looks at the structural constraints and supports that can affect entrepreneurial resilience of immigrant businesses. They had pre-pandemic challenges, that were related to, access to capital and language issues, cultural translation issues. But these were exacerbated basically by government responses to COVID-19. They had difficulty accessing the financing supports from COVID-19. And so therefore they had problems accumulating enough resources to survive. There were less support provided to immigrant businesses in some countries. Immigrants also didn't just generally trust institutional sources of information about the pandemic because they come from places sometimes that you don't trust the institutions. So that created a lot of communication issues that negatively affected immigrants. At the meso level, embeddedness level, we look at opportunity resilience, the business opportunity, and the nature of the opportunity, whether you're self-employed versus employing other people. Those businesses differ in their ability to survive and the resilience. And there's a much more of a movement in and out of self-employment than there is in and out of like a larger business that employs other people. So you can probably figure out why. It's a little bit easier if you're self-employed. If you find a better job working for someone else, then you will go to that job, right? The ownership arrangement will affect, the access to needed resources, and the team can really impact how the organization grows at the management level, and so that's also a part of embeddedness at the opportunity level. So there's some overlap also when you look at the consideration of the entrepreneurial opportunity level and the psychological resilience of the entrepreneur, because many people who start their businesses are their babies, right? So there is this connection between the two. And here you can see the self-employed opportunity, of course, is very much completely the same as the psychological resilience of the entrepreneur. Whereas the larger ones would depend more on the team itself, but it's still very embedded. So at the micro level, we look at this individual level of the entrepreneur and their own psychological resilience. And so generally at the micro level, we look at, or at the individual level, we look at personal attributes and competencies that are developed through personal experiences that allow individuals to navigate difficult events. And that's a fairly frequent resilience definition, but that's really depending on the trait perspective. Sorry, I forgot to turn off my clock, but it's almost done. Anyway, it is really building on the trait perspective. So we look at these psychological and dispositional factors like competence or societal support systems and personality traits. And so, you look at the characteristics of migrant entrepreneurs. Some researchers have recently found that they actually helped them weather the COVID-19 pandemic because they had just an innate resilience, this twice made resilience, in fact, where they come from another country, having to be resilient there to overcome many obstacles in a number of cases to then move here and start over. So they do have this innate characteristic that can help them. From a process perspective, we look more at the mechanisms through which the internal and external assets are engaged when people are faced with adversity. So for instance, can they engage networks that can offer them support, emotional support or instrumental support like financial or person support, including business-related resources during COVID-19. So those are the things that will help as well in terms of developing that psychological resilience. So it's a little bit of a messy concept, I think. There are arguments for antecedents and outcomes of resilience all being gathered together in this nice big silo of resilience. So there certainly is probably a need to further examine and distinguish resilience from antecedents and outcomes. So in our sample, we were looking at this then through two different lenses. The first data set we had was actually supposed to be a longitudinal data set collected at two different times with the SME owners and the employees and matched. However, we had a lot of trouble getting responses on this. And, sometimes the businesses went out of business or they were closed, so their employees were laid off, or they were just really busy and ramping up. And so they had no time to do this. So what we've settled on is we're just using the Time One data set for the 77 small business owners. And these are backbone businesses, right? And that we're talking about in both the first and the second data set. These are businesses like restaurants, retail, services, personal services, things that make our lives move forward. These aren't the really fancy, innovative, high growth ones. These are just your regular businesses that make our society work. So of the first data set, there were 14 immigrants that emigrated from 13 different countries. And 2/3 of the native born SMEs and 1/2 of the immigrant SMEs were considered essential services. So very healthy amount on both ends. That's probably why they answered it, because they were still in operation, right? So the SMEs categorized as essential during the pandemic were larger, and non-essential SMEs were more likely to be family owned. The second data set is comprised of 20 interviews with recently migrated owners of mainly nascent SMEs at 2 times, before and during COVID. So at the macro level, we're looking at, some of the political and structural issues, institutional issues that affect these businesses and the people running them, and especially the firm resilience, though. And there was a real positive impact of political decisions with respect to essential frontline services, because in both studies, they both continued to operate. And in fact, they actually became very healthy, in terms of where they were going. But there is a huge negative impact of political decisions. 45% in the study 2 sample had either closed or delayed opening their businesses due to the pandemic. So, that became a real issue that was just
2 minutes, Francine.
difficult to surmount. 2 more minutes? Okay. There were just insufficient resources to overcome operational challenges, and they had a lot of concerns about how they could even retain their employees. They drained their savings to meet the additional regulatory restrictions and requirements for safety supplies. And that was study 2. That also came up in study 1 across both native born and immigrant businesses. Oops, sorry. So at the MESO level, that's at the opportunity level, the business opportunity level. And we're looking at, again, resilience of the business opportunity itself. There were 2 themes that came up, and these had to do with communication, employee communication and customer communication. So most SMEs develop formalized strategic and operational communication. And they really focused on developing team cohesion, like game nights, that type of thing, very informal. But the immigrant owners were more focused on task and much more directive with the employees. Their quotes on the open-ended questions were much more directive. And they definitely had different employer expectations of the employees' motivations, initiative, and resilience. And I think that the immigrants weren't sure how much they could trust their employees to get something done. So they felt more directive. They had lower expectations of them. Whereas some of the other SMEs, they would be saying things like, well, we sent the employees home and they developed their own work plan. Whereas an immigrant might say, I developed it for them. And the customer communication was a real problem, because there was a real lack of connection with customers. Customers didn't even know when the businesses were open, and a real preference for return to face-to-face operations. And this appeared to be more of an issue with the immigrants, possibly because they just weren't embedded enough in the community. And then at the micro level, we looked at the owner. And, the owner was important. Making sure I'm okay mentally was a direct quote as a key employee support strategy. So making sure that, the owner was feeling healthy himself, then was able to provide more support to their employees. So that was an important part of it. Study 2, the immigrants had overcome so many personal challenges. Many of them were from Syria and Iraq. And there was stress related to trying to plan or open the Canadian business during the pandemic. And it really created illness in some and directed them to pursue other employment paths. And this is my last slide, Kelly. So, and the implications then of these studies is we tried to synthesize the 2 of them and use the embeddedness framework, in which, multi-level relationships reinforce a macro level and the importance of government support. And many of the study 2 participants were self-employed nascent businesses that were suspended, potentially because they didn't meet structural requirements to access government aid. So there were still some real challenges at the meso and micro level that government policy could not help. The pandemic focused management practices on basic communication with customers and employees, and the resilience, the entrepreneurial resilience was important at both the organization and the individual level of the SME owner. So, so that concludes our preliminary findings on these. We're going to have a chapter in the book that will look pretty much like this, but there will be quite a larger, I guess, a review of study 2 in particular, for because there's a huge amount of information in study 2 that I haven't touched on. Thank you.
Francine, thank you so much. And we look forward to being able to ask you some more questions about that at the end of the session. Now I would like to welcome Victoria Volishna, PhD candidate at the School of Human Resources Management at York University, and she will present a paper on skilled migrants, city integration, and migrant resilience. Welcome, Victoria.
Victoria, you're muted.
Sorry. Oh my God. I told the most important, information while I was muted. Sorry. So a couple of words before I start presentation. So this study was conducted with Dr. Jelena Zikic, who is my supervisor, and it's a qualitative study, and the most predominantly data has been conducted before pandemic has started. So this study does not is not about like any kind of COVID related, and mostly it's about interaction of migrants and cities. So this study about how people presenting today is about how people change cities they live in. So mainly we were concentrated on particular population of skilled migrants who come to Canada and decide permanently settle in different Canadian cities, and they come from different countries. Skilled migrants predominantly those people who have at least bachelor's degree, and they decide to restart their careers in Toronto, in Montreal and Vancouver. It depends the city.
Victoria, you're muted again.
Victoria, you're muted.
Sorry, that's my computer. So in this study, we wanted to understand how cities as physical and geographical space might impact skilled migrants' careers and their resilience. So we were inspired by cities' differences, and they wanted to know how skilled migrants perceive these differences and how their interaction with cities and physical objects, and how cities like a system of physical objects might impact migrants' resilience. So we know that majority of I will be talking about later that majority of migrants they prefer to settle in Toronto and Montreal as the main gateway cities in Canada, but they come from different cities. So for example, some of our participants, they came from Hong in the 70s, and which was at that time, more complex than Toronto back then, yeah. And some of them, they came from Mumbai, like in 2000, and some of them came from Europe, and how they, interact with the new city environment. So it was our main intention when we started this study. So as we know, Canada is a migrant in the country, and almost 300,000 people come to Canada every year, and 30% of these people, they prefer to settle in Toronto. So Toronto is the main gateway city. It's the largest city and international financial and business center. So majority of migrants, they choose Toronto as a destination because they know that Toronto usually offers higher wages, better infrastructure, concentration, it's a concentration of various industries, better housing. So they strive to stay in Toronto and find job here and restart their careers. So it's not surprisingly, though, that migrants share multiple membership in various communities and collaborate and need to communicate with each other through various boundaries, such as language, cultural, predominantly cultural and language barriers. And when they move, for sure, they experience a sense of disorientation. They are unfamiliar with the new environment, and for sure, this physical and new, like physical environment impacts them somehow. And for sure, it impacts how they, can reestablish and rebuild their career and how they can be resilient. So therefore, they, face challenges of incompatibility between their new host city and old physical settings, old home cities. And for sure, they already established the previous, previous connection with their physical environment, and these connections have been discontinued when they moved to Toronto. So as a result, they need to, being discontinuous from their previous physical environment, they need to build their new careers, and with new different rules, new rituals, new norms and scripts, and they need to adjust somehow and understand what's around them. So in general, the research shows, the previous research shows that city and its physical objects, which is we call city artifacts, they play a great role in how migrants bounce back after these challenges they face. And the role of city and its objects and physical artifacts in the city process of building migrant resilience has not been clearly stated so far. Therefore, the purpose of this research was to explore the role of these urban settings and city artifacts and understand how these physical settings guide migrants' resilience. In order to achieve the purpose of the research and answer the question how really city impacts migrants' resilience and their career, we brought theory of boundary objects. So that's a very, unusual and unfamiliar to public audience theory. Usually not has not been applied before in any case to understand migrants' experience in the cities. And that's why I need to explain a little bit what are boundary objects, because usually people ask, so what it is? So boundary objects, it's a theory of boundary objects that was established by sociologists when they studied in artificial intelligence. And Susan Lee Starr is the author of this theory, and it has been widely used in usually when researchers investigate how people collaborate together inside the organization. So boundary objects are defined as material artifacts or practices that share between different communities and used between different groups. So the main function of boundary objects is they help to learn, to collaborate, interact with people who belong to different communities, but wanted to share some kind of common experience and understand each other better. So usually they vary from concrete boundary objects to more abstract. And concrete boundary objects are newspapers, magazines, geographical maps, while abstract boundary objects is more like, for example, libraries and some common, some institutions where people come together and collaborate with each other. So the study was conducted in 2018, 2017, and 2019. So we collected interviews. It's a qualitative study, and we conducted in general 47 interviews. They all were transcribed and analyzed with elements of grounded theory. So we usually use 3 stages of coding. It's open coding, actual coding, and selective coding. And the result of this analysis was the model. It's a process model that was built in order to understand how actually boundary objects impact migrants' career resilience. And in general, I will be talking about briefly about each of these squares right now, and we'll provide some quotes of participants. But in a nutshell, the model shows that looking for cities similarities and and differences help to establish city belongings for migrants. And as soon as they establish these belongings, they try to reestablish career and focus their interaction with boundary objects with 3 main strategies: object orientation, exploration, and creation. And in the end, it helps them to integrate functionally or holistically. So, so the final outcome is a career reestablishment, which could be done in 2 dimensions. So, first square is about special continuity and city belongings. So when migrants just initially come to the city, what they start doing, they start comparing visually and spatially their host city with their home city. So they compare experience, and they try to compare, how the city they live in look like, and what's the difference in their new environment and new city. And migrants evaluated and compared experience of their new city, and they usually use memories of their previous cities they lived in. And as a result, they discovered, okay, I'm connected, or I am not. If the city were really familiar, they established this connectedness very fast. While if the city was different, it took some time to establish and understand, okay, so here, for example, this, sometimes they even compare, physical places, or they were looking for some familiar cafes, stores, or, we had an interesting participant who was a composer. And he, in order to establish connectedness to the city, he came to the University of Toronto and was, walking around conservatory when, musicians are musicians, they get their education, or he went to some kind of places that he could establish and feel this connectedness with his profession, because he was a musician. So he went to Roy Thompson Hall. So he's trying to find, this physical object that connects, that he was exposed in his home city versus in, in the host city. And as soon as, they feel, okay, I found belongingness, they started this career establishment process. So first, migrants use city objects such as brochures, newspapers, and magazines to orient themselves in the city, and we name, type, label this strategy as boundary object orientation. And as soon as the orientation has been done, migrants sought to use the city artifacts to translate their social capital, to search for local educational institutions, and to overcome various barriers around local boundary objects. They started to explore.
2 minutes, Victoria.
Okay. And finally, you know, like some of migrants, they were even involved in creating those artifacts, physical objects that can boost resilience of other migrants. So they created like a telephone, you know, like telephone books when everybody can call from a specific community, can call to each other. So usually it helps to create social connectivity and help other people to feel that they belong to the city. And I prepared a couple of quotes from our participants. I just read the one for the sake of time. So, for example, when participants were involved in creation of boundary objects, they one of our participants, Henry, told us, I published the telephone directory of Bangladesh in Toronto, and I was phoning everyone and asking, you know, anybody else from our country? This way I contacted a lot of people and I helped others to get in touch and connect. There was little communication at that time, and this helped, I think a lot to other people to communicate with each other. So in terms of outcomes, so career establishment process was done by two ways, so functional versus holistic integration. So functional integration means that people, you know, just focus on achieving personal goals and personal resilience versus holistic integration. They were really inclusively and externally focused and they wanted to integrate into the society. And here is a good example of holistic integration overall, who you know, who shared with us that she truly wanted to integrate. So I want this world to become one. I believe more and more that all world is one. I belong to Canada, but I belong to my country as well. So it's an integration between her past country and Canada. And I'm saying integration. So integration is my way of thinking. So this is how she shared with us the holistic type of integration, really to become dissolving to country. It's like a genuine understanding of the country's tradition, and boundary objects help her, you know, like doing further integration. So in general, main contribution of the study is like we brought understanding of continuity and belonging to the city, which increased migrant resilience. So we try to understand the role of city artifacts in migrants' career establishment, so the desire of their self-continuity and belonging was very necessary for migrants, and artifacts, boundary objects helped them to establish this, their careers, to find them their, you know, like their past experience, to bring their past experience and successfully integrate and reduce their resilience and function. And finally, functional versus holistic integration showed how migrants interacted and learned about the physical objects, the artifacts in the context. That influence their social integration and increase their resilience. So, in a nutshell, that's the result of the study. For sure, the study biggest I just presented many points that we wanted to share. But our chapter is also coming, which will be a little late, later than planned. So thank you so much for listening to me.
Thank you, Victoria. And we look forward to chatting with you more after our final presentation. And our final presentation is coming from Valerie Preston of York University, where Valerie is a professor of environmental and urban change. Valerie is going to present Immigrant Essential Work and Resilience, a comparison among metropolitan areas. Welcome, Valerie.
Hi. Hang on, everybody. Have I got the right screen? Wait a minute. No. Hang on just a minute. Okay. Let me try one more time. That's fine. Okay. Just bear with me, guys, while I try and sort this out. Something's happened to my Zoom. I think I know what the problem is, but I don't know how to fix it, which is about par for the course right now. So hang on a second. Well, I have a look at all this and see if I can fix it. Okay. All right. So let me see if I can now share this. Okay. Marcia, am I sharing the right screen? Nope. Yes? Okay. All right. The work I'm going to talk about today is nowhere near as interesting as what you've just heard. Marcia and I were interested in understanding the segmentation of the labor market at a metropolitan level. We wanted to know if immigrant men and women were working in the same industries as Canadian-born men and women. And that has become a topic of tremendous interest with the pandemic, because work greatly affects your chances of contracting the virus. It also affects your ability to work from home. It also affects the chances that you'll be unemployed or your hours will be reduced. And as the mother of now grown children, I am immensely grateful that my kids grew up and left home before the pandemic, because my neighbors are trying to homeschool 2 kids and manage their jobs. And the ease of doing that really depends upon your employment. Marcia and my original interest in this topic comes from the fact that employment is highly segmented. Overall, services are feminized, and construction and manufacturing, the goods producing industries, tend to be male dominated. The other aspect of employment that's segmented is that immigrants tend to be concentrated, not all of them, but many, in dirty, dangerous, and undesirable jobs. And what I find particularly interesting is the fact that when you look at the analyses of the impact of COVID on workers, they concentrate on either gender or immigrant status. So on the left-hand side of what I hope you're seeing is 2 diagrams that were created by RBC Economics at a national level, pointing out that women have been much more likely to fall out of the labor force since February 2020, and that is particularly true for women with children. And on the other side of the screen is a graph from New York City showing that in many of the industries in New York City that the city considers to be frontline industries, there are large proportions of foreign-born workers. And what I find interesting is nobody brings these 2 together. And so what we ended up trying to do in this little paper is figure out the extent to which the jobs of immigrant men and women affect their risks from COVID-19. We used 2016 census information. We compared employment in essential industries for 4 groups, and I'm going to keep referring to those 4 groups: immigrant men and women and Canadian-born men and women. And we looked at workers' employment in those industries across the metropolitan area, some metropolitan areas. So what do we mean by essential work? Essential work is public facing in many cases, not always. It cannot be done remotely in most cases, and involves often interactions with people particularly vulnerable to COVID. The elderly, the ill, children who have a fairly high risk, who have some risk of catching COVID but don't get sick, thank God. Essential work is identified by industry. I find this fascinating, both in regulation and in the academic literature. We're going to look at 7 industries. The only one that's at all controversial here is education. We included, or I included, education largely because of the debates in Ontario about whether teachers should be providing education in person or online. The teachers clearly feel that it's threatening for them, at least in the primary and elementary grades. Some teachers feel it's a threat for them to go back to work, as do some of the high school teachers. So I included it. And the list of industries there corresponds fairly well to what the public health people have been identifying as essential work. We looked at essential work from a social resilience perspective, and all that means is we wanted to look at the roles of social institutions. The pandemic presents a challenge for everyone. It particularly presents a challenge for women, as I've mentioned, also presents a challenge for immigrants. And a social resilience approach focuses on available formal and informal institutions, the relations among those institutions, and inequality in access to institution. So when I do talk very briefly about policy, we're not going to talk about individual resilience. We're going to talk about institutional responses. This is very unlike the infographic there about 10 ways to build resilience, which is one that really emphasizes this idea that resilience is an individual capacity. I'm interested in how the institutional landscape shapes people's capacities to respond to adverse events. When we looked at employment, we looked at, I'm going to talk about 7 metropolitan areas. I want you to look at the green arrow down here towards the bottom. I want you to notice that in Sherbrooke, Quebec, for example, almost 77% of the workforce is employed in these essential industries. But in Ottawa, Gatineau, which Brian Ray always reminds me is different, he might say special, it's only a little bit more than half the workforce. I also want you to notice that in the large metropolitan areas, Toronto and Montreal, in general, the percentage of the workforce in essential industries is smaller than in the second-tier metropolitan areas. The exceptions are Ottawa, Gatineau, and Quebec City. And these are 2 metropolitan areas, one the national capital, one the provincial capital, which have a very high proportion of employment in public administration and services to businesses, all of which can be done from home. The second thing I want you to notice are these pink arrows. The largest essential industry tends to be wholesale and retail trade, but that is not always the case. Windsor, for example, Francine stands out because manufacturing is almost a quarter of the workforce. I had no idea. And healthcare and social services, manufacturing and healthcare and social services kind of wrestle to be in second place. And in a city like Sherbrooke, which is a very important regional center, healthcare and social services comes out as the second most important employer of the essential industries. So 3 of them, wholesale and retail trade, manufacturing, healthcare and social services in the top 3, but always sort of juggling for position depending upon which metropolitan area you're looking at. And I want you to keep those metropolitan variations in mind. So we have looked at the distribution of employment for each of our 4 groups of workers across those essential industries. And we have some wonderful diagrams. If I was teaching, I could spend an hour just talking about this one, but I will spare you. There are 3 patterns of employment segmentation. First, if you look at the top industry, construction, utilities, transportation, and warehousing, gender really matters, but it doesn't matter whether you're an immigrant or Canadian born. So the top group are Canadian born women. Then we have Canadian born men, immigrant women, immigrant men. And what I want you to notice is that the percentage of women is always less than the percentage of men. And it is the same for Canadian born and immigrant women. And the percentages of immigrant men and Canadian born men finding work in this sector are also almost identical at around 12%. There's a second, a much larger group of essential industries in which the effects of being a man or a woman and the effects of being immigrant or Canadian born lead to very complicated patterns. So manufacturing, which we've heard a lot about in Toronto, immigrant men clearly have the largest share of the workforce in this essential industry, followed by Canadian born men, then immigrant women, and coming way at the back, Canadian born women. Educational services, it's reversed. Canadian born women have a larger share of their employment in this sector than immigrant women, Canadian born men, and lowest immigrant men. And so we can go through each of these and pick out which of those four groups is finding more opportunities for employment in that essential industry and which one less. The outcome is, if we look at immigrant women, they have a high share of employment in healthcare, accommodation and food services, and other personal services. This means that in terms of the impact of COVID-19, healthcare, of course, was one of the sectors where we expected a lot of transmission, and there was transmission at the beginning of the pandemic. Other personal services and accommodation and food services are two of the essential industries most affected by unemployment and reduced hours. In contrast, immigrant men are really overrepresented in manufacturing in Toronto, and they are most likely in manufacturing to experience a risk of contracting COVID and transmitting it because of a crowded workplace. And finally, I'm intrigued by these Canadian-born women in education, very worried about contracting COVID at work. In Montreal, what you find are similar patterns, except for the following. In Montreal, there is no essential industry in which gender and immigration status don't matter. Every industry has this complicated pattern where whether you're a man or a woman, whether you're an immigrant or Canadian born, really affects the share of employment in that industry. The second thing about Montreal that is interesting to me has to do with this construction. The construction, utilities, transportation, and warehousing industry is very much dominated by Canadian-born men in Montreal. It matters which metropolitan area you're looking at, and that shift is really important. The other thing I would note here, the continuing importance of education for Canadian-born women, but I want you to look at healthcare. It's not just that it's female dominated in Montreal, it is really immigrant dominated. And we know from other research that in Montreal, most of those immigrant workers, or a large share of them, are in the bottom part of the occupational hierarchy within healthcare. And these are the workers that are most vulnerable to contracting COVID by working with vulnerable people in long-term care homes, going to people's homes as personal support workers. So the patterns are similar and slightly different in Montreal than they are in Toronto. And the important thing to take away is that it matters what your gender is, but it also matters whether you're Canadian born or immigrant in every single one of these essential industries. And since Kelly is moderating this, Ottawa Gatineau, Brian's right, Ottawa is different. Although I hate to admit it. It appears that-
And you've got 2 minutes to tell us why, Valerie.
Oh, well, I'm going to explain very quickly and come to the conclusions. I've got 2 more slides. Manufacturing in Montreal, in Ottawa Gatineau looks a lot more like Toronto than Montreal does. It matters for men. It's not very important for women. It's actually a minor sector, which we know. but it's interesting to me that it has a similar pattern to the one we see in Toronto. The other thing that I want you to notice is that in Ottawa-Gatineau, Canadian-born men are the ones who have the largest share of their employment in wholesale and retail trade. And wholesaling, those are the Amazons of the world, have been identified as a place where workers are really at risk. Now, I do have something to say about Sherbrooke, but I'm going to leave it. But the only thing I want to say is I want you to notice in Sherbrooke, it's immigrants who are working in the education sector. It's really different. So what does all of this mean? Immigrant men and women and Canadian-born men and women work in different essential industries. And those patterns of employment vary from place to place. The relative importance of essential industries varies. The share of each group's employment in essential industries varies, and the relative importance of an individual industry varies. So what does this mean for policy? And I'm not going to have time to talk about this, which is just as well because I haven't thought about it and I'm looking for suggestions. I haven't thought about it enough. It seems to me that if we're going to mitigate the risks of COVID-19, its transmission, the unemployment, the exhaustion people are feeling trying to juggle home and work, we have to have policies that respond to the circumstances of each group of workers in each industry. And we have to take account of the local situation because the patterns of segmentation across essential industries are local. And I think what this means is, I went looking at the policy literature about essential work in the pandemic. If I read one more time that we need sick leave, which paid sick leave for everyone, I agree. But rather than emphasize the details of the policies, I think we have to put more emphasis on the process of policy making and planning. And it has to be local because the circumstances that pose risks for people that are altering their lives are local. And I think the public health units may provide an example of how we could go local in terms of decision-making and planning. The other thing is that at the local level, if we are going to use a social resilience approach, we have to draw on local institutions and they have to collaborate and coordinate. In Ontario, we have two examples, the local immigration partnerships and the workforce planning boards. These are examples of models of collaboration that bring together the full range of institutions in individual municipalities or metropolitan areas. And finally, there has to be coordination. And that coordination we saw with the Syrian Refugee Initiative has to be non-hierarchical. And finally, the thing that we've also learned from the Syrian refugee resettlement is that if we're going to promote collaboration and coordination and effective planning and decision-making, then we have to provide some resources. In Toronto, the vaccination rollout is led by the fire department, the chief of the fire department. And I have thought, why is this the case? Well, it's because the fire department is one of the lead agencies for the disaster and emergency management planning in Toronto, as it is in many municipalities and metropolitan areas or regional municipalities. And that is the structure that has been used to organize our pandemic response. So it's worth looking at because we do know that the disaster and emergency management plans get updated regularly, and it's worth looking to see why that is possible. So let me finish. I've taken more than 2 minutes. Thank you.
Valerie, thank you very much. And thank you to all of our presenters this afternoon. So appreciated hearing from all of you. Once again, please feel free to pop any questions that you have for our panelists into the chat. I know that we Did have a question earlier for Francine, and I know you responded to it, but I'm going to ask you maybe if you might speak to it just for a moment. So the question was, if you would speculate for us and tell us based on your research, what percentage of immigrant entrepreneurs you expect to survive and why? And if you would take a moment to speak to the group about that.
Sure. And you know, my colleagues are also on this call, Jerry Curran and Kyle Brickman. So they might also have some thoughts to add to this. But as I noted in the chat, in the end, self-employment has been found in Canada to be a great equalizer for income for immigrants and Canadian born. They reach parity much sooner. Otherwise, they're perpetually underpaid compared to Canadian born. So that in itself is just a continuing type of an economic stimulus to potentially move into your own business, as well as their innate resilience and obvious interest in entrepreneurship. Our second study had 20 people in it. None of them came in on an entrepreneurial stream, because we really don't have one right now unless you're going into the farm or you're going to use the startup visa, which is not funding the person. The startup visa is all about the idea. So it's a very, very different way of bringing in entrepreneurs. So if you're going to bring in small business people to support the backbone of our society, they're not coming in on startup visa. So in this particular case, they came in as refugees, many of them, because they were from the areas of conflict in Syria and Iraq. And even though they've put it aside for now, some have found other employment, one got sick. There were a number of different issues going on. A lot of them did actually have entrepreneurial experience in their own countries when they came over here. And so I think that we will see a rebound where even if we see a decrease post-pandemic, we're going to see lots of businesses starting in general. And for immigrants, it'll be the same thing.
Thank you, Francine.
I'm not sure. Actually, maybe Kyle and Jerry would like to add to that. They're here.
Sure. This is Jerry. I hope everyone can hear me.
Yes, Jerry.
Oh, good. Thank you. Yeah, Francine, thank you. I just want to add just a couple things. Valerie, first off, your question's a kind of tricky one to answer, because generally entrepreneurial ventures are high risk and they fail. I mean, we sort of know that from many, many years, and it depends on how you measure failure and what the venture can provide to those who start them. But just in a general sense, if you want to use something like, will the firm be around 4 years from now? Well, the failure rate is going to be high, and it's going to be above 50%, maybe as high as 70%. There's some give and take in the literature. So that's part of the context here. The other part of it is that the second group is quite a rare group in a lot of ways, because they're recent older immigrant entrepreneurs. So they've had a number of, or have taken on a number of different challenges and have already overcome them. So they've got I'm just going sort of from the first level analysis. We're not ready to present anything of depth yet, or work out a full framework. But just from my first level analysis of the interviews, I would say that there is a sort of wisdom that's being exercised here, a prudent management, maybe a sort of more precise way to put it. And a number of these people, when they were thinking about taking on the challenge just of starting their business, were very, very controlling of the way that they took on risk, and very incremental. And that's helped them both in general, but then also in terms of taking on the challenges of COVID-19. So we may want to talk about the businesses as being dormant, and then they're going to come back and to pick up Francine's point, either in a different form, or they will be just relaunched. But I would expect a good, fairly high percentage of the participants to be entrepreneurial again in some way, shape, or form. And I realize it's a vague answer, but that's sort of the best we can do right now.
Thank you, Jerry. And Kyle, before we move on, did you want to add to this?
Sure. Kind of going along with Jerry's saying there, a lot of this will obviously depend. The essential services obviously had a huge impact, as Francine described already, on the survival to begin with. So I think the embeddedness perspective is really helpful to think about what these immigrant entrepreneurs have that can help them. When you think about from a micro level, like that psychological resilience in the sense of being battle tested, I think would help them bounce back more than maybe non-immigrant entrepreneurs. But then on the flip side, we know that those macro level challenges of even accessing financing would work against them. So I also wouldn't be able to speculate, but there's nothing that would lead me to believe that it would be any different than non-immigrant entrepreneurs.
Thank you, Kyle. I've got a question now for Victoria. Oh, Valerie, you wanted to
I
add
have
to
a
that?
follow-up. Okay, I asked that question because the assessments of the Business Immigrant Program demonstrated that past entrepreneurial success wasn't a good predictor of entrepreneurial success in Canada, that immigrants, entrepreneurs had real challenges adapting to a new place. So can somebody just comment on that?
Do you mean me?
No, Francine or Jerry or Kyle, because there seems to be an assumption that if you've been an entrepreneur before, you'll do better in Canada. And in fact, that the research about the Business Entrepreneur Program that we used to have, remember, Francine, showed that wasn't the case.
I'd like to take
Yeah.
a stab at. I could take a stab
Please.
at it just to, as a first response is that here recent covers a period of 10 years. I don't know the time frame of the program, but it's critical that there a period of time passes in which language acquisition, in which to pick up one of the earlier presentations, in which some of the connections are made to the surrounding community. And learning the ropes, just generally in a bunch of different ways, and that all takes time. So I can't remember if anybody I interviewed had started their businesses in less than 5 years after they arrived. I don't think so. There were problems though for some. There are no questions about that, Valerie. And as well, it depends on how we're going to go back to your question again about success. It's how we're measuring it, and whether or not the participants are going to restart their business or learn from their experience and go with it. So it's a complex answer in a lot of ways. And again, if we're using especially a short time frame here to measure success, then I think you're going to get a far more negative outcome than certainly the people with whom I spoke anyway. And I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Jerry. And I'll move on. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Francine.
I'll just add something to that too. I think that when people come in on a certain stream, let's say a stream like entrepreneurship, and they start a business, then they're going to run into the issues that Jerry talked about. But when they come in on a different stream and they already have the experience, they have this interest in it still, but they will have time and supports, different kinds of supports to develop it out. So maybe where we should be putting our policy supports is as they acquire language and understanding of the culture, then we provide them with support. So rather than as soon as they step off whatever vehicle they're getting here with, they, instead of that, give them time and then offer them support and consider them recent within 10 years.
Thank you, Francine.
Sure.
We do have a question for Victoria. And Victoria, the question is if you could tell us a little bit more about the importance of belonging. And I might add to that too, we've had a couple of discussions about policy and recommendations. And as you tell us a little bit more about belonging.
Yeah, let me start with the previous, idea that was just said. If people are entrepreneurs in their home country, they will be better adjusting here. So I totally agree because, our study is aligned with this too. So if you, for example, came from big cities and you came to Toronto, which was at that time, simpler, those people adjusted very fast. And usually, it matters what you have done before. So when you come here, you adjusted faster if you already have these, patterns. And our study was done from the psychological perspective. So what it shows that, first of all, memories matter a lot. So but memories, it has some time, it takes some time to generate those memories. So our cognitive mind doesn't work so fast. So you need time to adjust to generate those memories. And at least, like it takes from 6 to 8 years in order fully to integrate and really feel that you belong, because what people were saying here, I brought my son to school, so now I'm connected to this place. And here I was participating in some conference, I'm connected to this place. Here I took my education, now I'm connected to this place. All those memories, like they need time to come to your mind and to stay there like for some period of time. And like one more thing which is interesting. So belongingness impacts not only it's not only like outcome, it also some kind of antecedent. Yes, so belongingness as an antecedent helps you to like to connect not only with your ethnic community. Usually people come and initially they try to be close to their ethnic community because of the language, tradition, norms, but also belongingness like helps you to go out of this circle, yes, and to join to different to what we say Canadian born, yes, people. And usually this can explain why second generation sometimes is doing better in terms of, for example, professional status or occupational status, because they are born with some kind of traditions and norms, while first generation, they need time to adjust. And usually if people come to Canada around 30s, like if they are already established skilled workers. So for example, I'm talking about my population. So skilled workers usually takes time in your country, yes, to become a skilled worker. Then you come to Canada and you need to restart your career like all over again. Usually it takes some time to get some preliminary, like understanding what's educational system or like language acquisition, and at least five years, yes, like in a nutshell, usually statistics says like 5 years to feel more into it. So this belonging takes time. Sorry, I just finished. And it impacts how you build your relationships, which is the most important for migrants, to build relationships beyond your community and to establish this social capital and networking capital, with people who really belong to the environment, to the working. Yeah, so
Victoria, I want to thank you. Thank you so much for the response. And I did in the minding the time. I'm afraid I won't have time for you to answer this question, but I did want to pose the question for you. This is a question from
one more question I did not answer. I'm sorry.
No, this is okay. And it's an interesting one, and perhaps you and Catherine Sanilar can connect offline because it is an interesting question. She's asking, are tangible objects such as newspapers and brochures, etc., as valid and as useful in this virtual technology environment, particularly as has been thrust forward with COVID-19. And so just thinking about things like the use of cell phone and online services, etc., when we come to discussions about belonging. I'm going to ask you not to answer that right now, but to keep that in mind and know that that's a question that has been posed and a very interesting question. I want to thank our panelists so much for these thoughtful and interesting presentations today. Thank you to our audience for engaging. Thank you for being here. I want to remind you that there is another session on June 23rd. So keep that in mind. And once again, Victoria has just shared her email in there if you want to follow up. Really appreciate all of you joining us, and I wish you an excellent rest of the day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Thanks, Kelly. Thanks, Francine. Thanks, Victoria. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Kelly. Bye.
Bye-bye.